Now. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Psychedelic Scene podcast. We are here today with Brian Lissak, who is a psychotherapist who works in clinical neurophysiology and also the director of ketamine-assisted psychotherapy at Behavioral Associates, a private practice in New York City. And his website is brianlissack.com if you'd like to find more about his work. Brian, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm very excited about this podcast because I think he merges two very promising fields of research and clinical work, and he's been able to not only work with both of them independently, he's been able to combine them into a very synergistic way so that you can get the benefits of both the ketamine assisted therapy and also the biofeedback, because we're going to talk about all of those today. But I'm really excited. I think it's a very interesting, and I haven't heard too many people do that yet. So he's on the cutting edge right now.
Cool.
And so, first thing, can you let the audience know, like, your background, how you got into this? And start there.
Yeah, definitely. I think like most people, a bit of a winding path. The description you just had of me, the psychotherapist, clinical neurophysiology, that's kind of that's where everything kind of converged to where I am right now. But on the way there, it really started with being a very intense basketball player. I played a few years in college in D3. When I stopped playing, I still continued being very physically active, got really into yoga, really into trail running, rock climbing, tree climbing. Always, grew up snowboarding and wakeboarding, and it's very, very physical. So very, very connected to my body in that way. Um, After college, I was in the military. Nothing too crazy, but it's just, it's not the most fun experience. And so afterwards, really nothing from the military, but had my own work to do that obviously I had to do before the military. I just didn't do it. And at that point, I got really into meditation and Tai Chi, deepened my yoga practice, continued trail running, continued rock climbing, and really saw how, rock climbing was no different than trail running, is no different than snowboarding. There was some underlying pattern to all of it. And my now wife, she was my fiance at that point, basically forced me to go to therapy, which I'm very grateful for. Big irony is, I'm a therapist now, but I was really anti-therapy. Um, Specifically sought out what's called a somatic psychotherapist, so really body-based in the energetic body. That's kind of what somatic means in the psychotherapy world. Had a really great experience with her. She was really, really transformative for me, really, really helpful to me. And so kind of combining that and then, decided to pursue psychotherapy because just kind of organically, I began working with people. They would see me doing Tai Chi in the park. It was weird, arm movements, twisting kind of things, and be like, "Whoa, what the heck is that?" And they were interested. I would teach it to them. It was really powerful for them. They would refer, quote unquote, refer me to a friend who would refer to a friend. It grew into like a nice little small business that I really loved doing. And what I realized through doing it was all body movements. I never intended for it to go beyond body movements. Um, but it would always end up essentially being a talk therapy session. Emotions would come up, memories would come up, thoughts, connections, patterns, in sometimes just in kind of small, insightful ways, and sometimes in overwhelming, like, really, really shocking kind of ways. And I felt and I found I had a knack for it. People seemed to want to continue working with me and talking with me in that way. And that's when I decided to become a therapist. Um, Fast forward through grad school, end up at the private practice I'm at now, really only because it was the best like uh, business opportunity I had. Like I got, got a good office. It's on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Pay rate was better than every other place. Didn't know too much about neurofeedback or biofeedback or any of these other kind of technological neurophysiological interventions. I was pretty crunchy. The Tai Chi, the yoga, big barefoot shoe guy. Kind of like looked at it pretty skeptically, but when I started interacting with it, it just immediately clicked. And I'll explain more going, in a few minutes what biofeedback and neurofeedback is. But it was taking all of my crunchy energy, somatic type of stuff, and not replacing it, but giving me another angle to achieve the same thing, to work with the same part of the body, because it really does come down to uh, energy and the nervous system and neurophysiology and how we react to certain things and the patterns that are underlying that. And a good somatic therapist or a good psychotherapist or a good Tai Chi instructor or a good massage that like there are 1,000 different ways to get at the same thing. And I just kind of view it as having more tools in my toolbox. Um, Ketamine, I was always psychedelically interested. Don't have relative to other people in this field, I have limited number of experiences relatively, but always saw the real power of it. And I think the reason I'm limited in my experience is because uh, not that other people are disrespectful of the power, but I never too keen on doing it, very close together. I would have an experience, take a long time to work through it and process through it and integrate it. So yeah, and then ketamine, it's what's legal right now. It's actually I really, really respect that chemical, that medicine, and how it specifically works with people. If every single drug was legal, I would still work heavily with ketamine because I really think it's a really powerful therapeutic medicine. So that's in brief.
Yeah, I think ketamine is a really very powerful one, and it's one of the right now it's like the only psychedelic really that's legal for therapeutic use, and that's mainly just because it's Schedule 3 substance and it's something that is essential in the hospital and emergency rooms. They need it. In fact, the World Health Organization lists it as a essential medicine, right? That all hospitals,
Yeah, yeah.
should basically have as a anesthetic.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, you mentioned a few things about stigma around mental health. You said, I think that's one thing that a lot of men, but also everybody really. I mean, that's still a big thing where people are afraid to talk about mental health or they're afraid to open up about it in fear of some, I don't know, judgment. And that even more so now, and even more in other countries, I would say. Some other countries, it's even more stigmatized than the US, but US used to be probably at that point too, right? We're only now starting to be open more about mental health and like, yeah, you should open up. Let's talk about it. It is important, and we shouldn't judge you negatively because you have some mental health condition. Um, where do you see that today, like where we're at, and how can we move forward around the stigma that we see?
Yeah, therapy is really trendy right now. I have a few clients or a few referrals every so often who are, as my New Year's resolution to do therapy, or it's 2023. I have my gym membership. I have a nutrition app, and I have my therapist. It's just what you do. I've definitely had a number of people whose lives are really great. They're not really stressed, and we have one or two sessions. Like you know keep doing what you're doing. Come back if something bad happens. Like the trend has really, really shifted the other way. Which I think, it's the pendulum swing that hopefully will come back in the middle uh, where mental health issues are recognized, acknowledged. There's not a stigma against, if someone, whatever, if you're suffering someone, you had a bad experience, you have some trauma history, or there isn't a stigma against that. I do think there is we do need to pull it back a little bit where we're not celebrating,
Hmm.
pathologies.
Hmm.
I remember a year or a few years ago, there was a fad on TikTok where, like, I think it was in like the 12, like young teenage age, where there was like a self-diagnosis fad, where it was almost like, they would like show their tics, and they would show how they had, dyslexia, or all these random things. And it definitely has, like any trend, it's gone too far the other way in some sense. I think in general, though, my supervisor, my mentor, Dr. Robert Reiner, he taught me all the biofeedback and neurofeedback stuff. He keeps pretty interesting statistics on, because he does every intake for the practice. It's a fairly large practice. This year is the first, was that this year or last year, but it's the first time where there's more men reaching out for therapy than women. Right, so there's
Hmm.
definite shifts in this, and I think in general, I'm a fan of it. I think it's overall a good thing. Obviously, there are some ways it's being misused and abused, but that goes with the territory.
Yeah. Yeah, I did not know that more men right now are reporting. That's
That's for our practice. I don't know if that's across the board,
oh,
but
okay. Gotcha. And what is, you said, you also talked about somatic therapy. That's one I didn't even know about until recently. There's also, it has something to do with touch, right? And there's also a lot of stigma around touch in psychotherapy practice or clinical. How does that work? Yeah.
yeah. So uh it doesn't necessitate touch. So soma is it's a Greek word. It has to do with like felt sense. So in
Mm,
somatic therapy, I'm actually forgetting the exact Greek definition, so don't judge me too hard. Um, but in CBT, right, like cognitive
mm,
behavioral therapy, which is very top down, it's a very powerful tool, but it's not the be all end all. But the CBT is very, if you're angry or you're anxious, a very bland but kind of typical question might be something like, well, what are you anxious about? Obviously, if you're a good therapist, it'd be more nuanced than that, but just painting a archetypal example. So if you're anxious, the question would be, what are you anxious about? Right? It's a very cognitive, intellectual, process. Somatic psychotherapy, a question might be, where are you anxious? Are you feeling it in your chest? Are you feeling some tightness or churning in your stomach? Is there a lump in your throat? Right? So it's
mm.
it's not it's not looking at
Okay.
feelings just as things that happen in your mind. Or we call them feelings for a reason. You feel them. They have
Mm,
a physical existence. It's not physical in the sense that we could, take an X-ray and see it, but it obviously is physical. You feel that tightness in your chest. You feel that lump in your throat. You feel the clenching in your stomach. So it's the energetic physical, so to speak. And so you can work with that, and it's really tapping into the intelligence of the body. So a good therapist will be able to provide a safe container for the client where they will feel comfortable enough to go kind of inside, go into their body and interact with I'm just going to use the tightness in the chest as the example, which otherwise they might try to ignore or suppress or push down. We want to do the opposite. We want to acknowledge it and allow it and actually make space for that and interact with it in a very literal way where we'll literally ask it, what are you here to tell me? Again, I'm fast forwarding through this kind of and giving archetypal examples, but what are you here to tell me? Anxiety in my chest, and you know, uh, a response will come up. And so it's another entry point. It's a deeper entry point into the human because memories, emotions are not just stored in the mind, right? The brain also isn't just in the head. The nervous system goes through the entire body, and those are tendrils of the brain essentially.
yeah, yeah, that's a good point because obviously there was a evolutionary reason why we developed to have certain signals of pain, right? There's a very tiny percentage of people who are alive or have existed who can't feel pain, and they usually don't live very long because that pain is trying to signal to them something is wrong and it needs to be addressed. And if they're not even aware that that pain is there, well, they're not that whatever is wrong is not going to get addressed most of the time.
Mhm.
And the same thing with anxiety. I would say anxiety also, I grew up with like severe social anxiety, so it was a major thing that I, worked on a lot over the years. I'm much better now, thanks to all these therapies and stuff, right? Um, but Anxiety is actually a complex emotion that humans have. Maybe some other high level primates, might have some anxiety, but anxiety is a complex emotion that's future oriented. You have to have the ability to be able to project into the future or predict. Not a lot of animals can fully do that. And anxiety is there to protect somebody from making poor decisions or from a potential threat into the future. And it's trying to tell us, hey, there's this potential threat. You have the ability now to listen to this anxiety and why this, you're feeling this way and act on it so you can minimize the risks, right? But we know today we have these anxiety disorders.
Mm. Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a very good way to describe it, and that's actually a good segue into biofeedback and neurofeedback in this whole world of clinical neurophysiology. Um, there's really interesting, definitely anecdotal reports. I think there's also some proper, like clinical research studies, um, and the overall catchphrase is "pain is pain." So you can take, something like an ibuprofen or a Tylenol or something like that, and it can actually help with, the pain of depression or of grief and things like that because what we call anxiety, and this is how I often describe it. Definitely some clinicians who would disagree with me, but anxiety is the subjective experience built on top of the objective neurophysiological state, right? You cannot be experiencing anxiety if your neurophysiology is not doing a specific thing
Mm.
or, one of a number of specific things. Um, So I guess that's a good segue into what biofeedback is, and neurofeedback is just biofeedback on the brain. So it's a subset of biofeedback. And this is a really powerful tool I use a lot with people. Again, no tool that I talk about is kind of self-contained or a be all end all, right? It's a tool in my toolbox with CBT, with somatic therapy, with ketamine, you know, with going for a run, with a bunch of different things. So biofeedback is a really powerful way to interact with your neurophysiology. And so what it is in a sentence is it's real-time biometric data being fed back to you for the purpose of manipulating something, whether it's your heart rate, your skin temperature, brain waves, muscle tension, whatever it is. The simplest way to describe it is using a form of biofeedback called EMG biofeedback or muscle tension biofeedback. And so an example of that would be, let's say someone has a shoulder injury, or they have a partial tear of a muscle. The body's part of the body's response is pain, kind of the way you talked about pain. It's something's wrong here. Don't use your shoulder that way. You have an injury, right? Okay, so let's say, you have that initially. Let's say it's a year later, the tear has healed, but the inflammation is still there. It's still tight. There is still some pain there. Right at that point, though, we can say it's unnecessary pain. There's unnecessary inflammation. It's unnecessary tightness because the injury is healed. So the response
Mhm.
that it was called up for, the reason is no longer there. So we can put EMG sensors on the shoulder muscle, which is still overly tight and having some pain and stiffness, connected to a biofeedback machine with biofeedback software on a computer, and on the computer there will be a red ball. As your muscle tenses, the red ball increases. It gets bigger. As the muscle relaxes, the red ball shrinks. So your conscious goal, the only thing you need to do as the client, is keep the red ball as small as possible. Not too long, you figure out, oh, when my shoulder relaxes, the red ball shrinks. And a lot of that is subconscious. With muscle tension, it's more conscious than, say, neurofeedback, or sweat glands or things like that. But that's basically what biofeedback is in a nutshell. It's measuring the whatever biometric you choose, giving real-time feedback on it so that you can manipulate it. You do that enough times, you will learn how to relax your shoulder muscle without needing the technology, without needing the biofeedback. Um, so it's basically, Pavlovian learning. It's classical conditioning, just used in a real clinical sense. So that's that's that. So that's really interacting with the body. So the biofeedback I use the most are two forms. One is called heart rate variability biofeedback, and the other is neurofeedback. I'll get to neurofeedback a bit later, but all of this is the same biofeedback principle. So heart rate variability is becoming also pretty trendy right now. A lot of these health things, mental health things, you'll see them in a lot of different, newspaper articles and different devices, et cetera, coming out. Heart rate variability refers to the variation in heart rate from beat to beat. And I'll also get into the nervous system in explaining this as well. So this is very different than how we usually think about the heart rate. If someone says, I have a resting heart rate of 70 beats per minute, you think that's 70, 70, 70, or you think it's pretty static, almost like a flat line.
Hmm.
If that's the case, that's a problem. It should be, 60, 80, oscillating like that with variation. The higher the variability, we can say really in really broad terms, the healthier you are, and also the less stressed you are. Stress being a technical term of nervous system state. Um, so the reason heart rate oscillates like that, or it should, oscillate and variate like that, is because we have two main parts of our nervous system. One is sympathetic, or quote unquote fight flight, and the other is parasympathetic, or quote unquote rest digest. And so they do opposite functions. Right? We're pretty familiar with fight flight.
Yeah.
Just it's kind of entered the colloquial lexicon. Um, because that's a stress state.
Hmm.
But balancing that, or what should be balancing that, is rest digest. So when you have full spectrum access to your nervous system and you're calm, you should have access to both fight, flight, and rest digest. And it's also connected to the breath. So every time you inhale, it activates the sympathetic branch of your nervous system, so your heart rate increases. Every time you exhale, it activates the parasympathetic, or the rest digest part of the nervous system, so the heart rate decreases in this oscillating way. And that's the ideal state to be in when you have full access to both. So kind of as you are right now, if we were in the same room, you could be sitting here, you're calm, you can listen to me, you have full access to, the cognitive rational part of your brain, you have access to memories, all your body temperature is regulated. And if I were to throw a ball at your head kind of completely unexpectedly, you would duck, or you would block it, or you'd catch it, you would react. You're not waiting in a defensive posture, but you still have access to that if you need to. So
Hmm.
you're calm and alert. Right? That's the ideal state to be in for most of life.
Hmm.
um, so that's the ideal. That's balance. That's coherent. When someone's anxious, they essentially only have half of their nervous system. They have fight flight. The parasympathetic branch, the rest digest part, is shut off, because what anxiety is, or what that stress response is, it's a life or death situation.
Hmm.
Imagine you're walking through the jungle, whatever, it's a million years ago, you're walking through the jungle, you're picking berries with your buddy. You would be in that coherent state that I mentioned, right? Calm and alert. You're focused, but you're also, you're calm. You're walking through the forest picking berries. All of a sudden, you hear a low rustling in the bushes, 50 feet off to your right, and you recognize it's a lion. Okay, so that's a distinct threat. That's an acute threat. You're threatened at that moment, so your body will automatically shut off anything that is not necessary for dealing with that threat. Resting, digesting, everything else that the parasympathetic nervous system has to do with is shut off. Really cognitive thinking, it's too slow to deal with that threat. You need just
Hmm.
instinctual reaction. Memory formation, access to memories, completely unnecessary. You have a lion trying to eat you. So anything not related to either fighting the lion or fleeing, running from the lion, is shut off. Obviously, there's a lion. That should only be an acute situation. That should only be a 10, maybe 20-minute circumstance. If it's more than
Hmm.
that, you're probably dead. So now fast forward a million years and you're sitting on your couch and you're feeling anxious, but externally you're obviously safe. But if you're anxious, your nervous system is in that exact same state that it was a million years ago with the lion, or just if you're being mugged or whatever. Your body doesn't differentiate between an actual existential threat versus not. If you're in a stress state, if you're in an anxiety state, your body is acting as if there's a lion about to eat it, and it's sensing that. So this is where heart rate variability biofeedback comes in, because if you're in that state, you don't have access to cognition. You don't have access to the memories. You don't have access to any of that. So
Mm,
something like, CBT, while it's a really powerful tool, it has real limitations. Um, if you're in a stress state, you don't really have access to cognition. That part of your brain is turned off. How the heck are you going to do cognitive behavioral therapy? It's just not going to land. And this is, and I've seen it 1,000 times, and many therapists have, where you'll go over the exact same thing week after week after week, month after
mm,
month. It's not landing because the body, you're not in a position to learn. You're not in a position to access cognition and do something different. So we need to kind of leave the cognition to the side for the moment, and we just need to re-regulate the nervous system because there's a huge feedback loop here. It's not just a top-down thing where your eyeballs sense a threat or see a lion, which and then send a signal to your body to activate a sympathetic arousal, a
mm,
fight-flight state. It also works the other way, right? There's something called interoception. Your body is constantly in this two-way communication, sensing cues and signals within your body. It's something like a gut feeling. Uh, that's real. Your body is constantly sensing for that. And so if your nervous system is in a state where it's sensing a threat, or at least sending signals of a threat, it's going to send that message up to your brain. Right? So it's not just a top-down thing. It's a feedback loop. It's a two-way communication. So heart rate variability is really simple. We use two metrics to measure. One is heart rate, obviously, and the other is respiration rate, right? Again, the two branches of the nervous system are tied to your breath. Inhale activates fight flight, exhale activates rest digest. So when you're stressed, you inhale, fight flight is activated, heart rate increases. You exhale, again, you're stressed, you don't have access to rest digest, so nothing happens. The heart rate stays at that elevated level. So in that case, your heart rate would look more like 100, 100, 100, right? There is no variation.
mm.
You only have access to half of your nervous system. When that's chronic, that becomes really bad, right? Uh, you don't eat, everything gets messed up. Digestion gets messed up. Memory formation, sleep, cognitive ability, mood regulation, metabolism. Like everything is not predicated on, but interacts significantly with the nervous system. Um, so heart rate variability biofeedback training, we're seeking to the biofeedback is using the biometric of your heart rate to increase the variability. And you do this via respiration and a specific type of respiration. Uh, one of the physiological signs of stress is what's called thoracic breathing. It's chest breathing, like your thoracic cavity. If you ever see, or maybe you've experienced a panic attack, it's real, your shoulders are kind of heaving up and down in these really rapid, kind of shallow breaths. Right? Well, imagine you're running. You need to breathe kind of, if you're a good runner, but
Mm.
if you don't do this, but if you're sprinting in an acute situation, you're going to take rapid, shallow chest breaths. You don't have access to long, deep belly breaths. So that's exactly what we do, though, is we just do the opposite of what the stress response is. We take really long, deep belly breaths. It's called diaphragmatic breaths. And eventually, sometimes it takes 2 minutes, sometimes it might take longer than that. Um, but the important thing is to train it over time. But through breathing with your diaphragm in a really antithetical way to the stress response and these long, slow belly breaths, you reactivate the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system and restore balance and coherence.
Yeah. Um, One thing that we were taught for getting into a parasympathetic state, and I think you mentioned this earlier with breathing affecting our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, to when you inhale, it puts you in a sympathetic state, is that
Yep.
right?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
then when you exhale, puts you in that rest and digest state.
Yep.
So one practice that I've learned doing breath work for some time was if you want to get yourself calm in a parasympathetic state, make the exhales longer than
Mhm.
your inhales.
Yep.
And that will, like, for example, maybe 4 seconds inhale, 8 seconds exhale. That'll put
Hmm.
you in a very calm parasympathetic state. Is that
Exactly.
right?
Yep, exactly. And that's based on the same, it's all the human. It's all based on the same nervous system. Biofeedback is really powerful because you have the information, you have the feedback. There was a both a conscious and a subconscious learning process. And so, and I was shocked, right? This sounds kind of ridiculous, but then I started doing it, and I, like most people, will feel anxiety. I will have an overreaction to certain things. Um, and I had unlimited, unfettered access to it in my office. So I just started doing it a ton, really playing with it, and just I was shocked by it. And so I started using it, both to start my day. I bought like an at-home device from a company called HeartMath. I
Hmm.
don't have any connection to them. I don't get any any kickback. I should, um, but it's the size of a pair of headphones. And so I would start my day with it. It would set me up right. I would use it if I was overly stressed or had a really tough session or whatever, something happened. I started using it after I would play basketball or do longer, bigger workouts, because it restores that balance, right? We're always seeking balance. The After survival, the next strongest impulse that our body has, that everything is geared towards, is homeostasis, is
Hmm.
balance, right? And so this is really, this works across the spectrum. You can be the super hippie or super buttoned up scientist. We want balance, and it's true across the board on every level that you look at. So this ability to take yourself out of sympathetic dominance, out of a stress state, and put yourself into a physiological state of coherence, will give you access to interact with the anxiety in a different way. So I've had many, many times, and this is exactly what I look for, where a client will say, unless the client specifically struggles with, panic attack disorder or, just bad anxiety, they'll say, so I'm having the anxious thought, but I don't feel anxious. So they get that separation from the anxious thought versus the anxious feeling, whereas normally they're conflated into one thing. I have that test next week. Obviously, that's anxiety inducing. Well, no, not necessarily. You've married the two. You've conditioned yourself in a
Hmm.
sense to conflate test next week with anxiety, including the physical feeling of anxiety. When you can decouple those, then we can interact. Then we have access to cognition. Then we have access to the higher order thinking that humans have, and we can think differently about the exam, about the test next week, or whatever the thing is that you're anxious about. We have access to different perspectives. We're not locked and entrenched in this one defensive stress posture where we're all signals inside of our body are saying you're existentially threatened, you need to survive. You're not going to make good choices from that decision, from that position. So if we can get the body out of that, then we have access to the thoughts and the memories, and in that sense.
Hmm.
Um, yeah.
So, yeah, I was thinking, I mean, a lot of these responses that we have, whether it's depression, anxiety, PTSD, or some other psychosomatic condition, possibly maybe stuttering, um, like a lot of these conditions are trauma responses. They're defense mechanisms. Uh, say, they're real responses that we need for survival. And when you're systematically traumatized as a child, or whatnot, your body starts to develop these protective defense mechanisms, because you have these traumas and you need something to protect yourself. You need something to be automatic, right? For your autonomic nervous system basically to react, so that when a certain situation appears similar to one of those traumatic incidences prior, you you don't even have to think. Your nervous system will act for you in order to protect you. But oftentimes trauma isn't continuously going, and now that was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and you're still having all these defense mechanisms there. You're still having these protective mechanisms, and they're not serving you at all. They're actually harming you or reducing your lifespan or whatnot. And that's where the nervous system again comes in, right? Is
Mhm.
if we can reprogram the nervous system to be more balanced, then you don't have those trauma responses or anxious or panic attacks, right? And ordinary situations where you shouldn't be having them.
Yeah. There's a learned association or a learned state where there's a theory called polyvagal theory, which is really, really useful in understanding kind of what the nervous system is there for beyond just protecting us from a lion. Um, Polyvagal theory, and I use this a lot, um, just this understanding. And a big part of my practice is educating my clients on the breakdown of their neurophysiology so that they understand kind of what's going on that level. And it really gives them a huge level of agency within it. And then I give them, tools with biofeedback, neurofeedback, other breath techniques, things like that. But polyvagal theory breaks the nervous system down into three levels in a hierarchy. The highest, the top level, which I think we're both in right now, we're able to communicate, feel calm, feel safe. Uh, it's called uh, it's called the social engagement system. And I'll come back to that. The next level down is fight or flight. That's sympathetic, and then underneath that is freeze. So
Hmm.
a huge part of our nervous system is actually social. And so if you're a child and you're growing up in a hostile environment, even if you're not being hit or starved or, like physically observable by a camera type of thing, abused, if you're in an unsafe environment, meaning unsafe emotionally, um, you won't grow up largely inhabiting your social engagement part of your nervous system, which is this balance that I was talking about. You'll spend a lot of time in either the sympathetic kind of fight or flight because you're trying to react and protect yourself, or the step below that in a freeze, which is kind of like a shutdown, like a possum playing dead type of thing. Um, we see a lot of kids, in broken homes or who just kind of some, act out very violently, and some, um, just kind of shut down and recede into themselves. And so our nervous system is always looking for cues of safety. And this is language I'm taking right from polyvagal theory. So we're
Okay.
always looking for cues of safety. So if as a kid, adults were dangerous, when adults is synonymous with authority figures, then as we go to school, we're going to have the same response with teachers, unless there's that really special teacher who, can
Hmm.
kind of recognize what's going on and just be kind and give those cues of safety. But, even so, as you grow up, then you're just going to overlay that onto, let's say, authority figures, just to take this one example, and your nervous system will respond in that learned way, right? Because uh, one way, and I don't mean to reduce humanity in this reductionistic sense, but one main function of our brain, which includes our nervous system, is to predict,
Hmm.
right? We learn, we don't go to a doorknob and have to rediscover what a doorknob is every time we use it. We can take past experience in order to streamline our activity and behavior today. So if our past experience tells us adults are dangerous, well, if adults are dangerous or authority figures are dangerous, we know without needing to think that we need to be in a specific posture when we're with them. And so we're going to overlay that. And that's true with everything. Also with good things, is, we're speaking from like a pathology or mental health perspective, so we're using bad examples, but it's also true with good things.
Hmm.
But the point is, it's a learned state, and it's the kind of thing where you lose, where like the fish asks, "What is water?" in that famous essay. It becomes so ubiquitous and so overlaid onto everything, so commonplace, you don't notice it anymore, which is the aha moment when you can then achieve a coherent state and you can actually examine that thought rationally, or that response rationally. You can say, huh, so that's been causing me a lot of stress, but now I can look at it from three different angles and I can actually interact with it with a level of agency and choose how I want to respond to this. And I can explore this and I can discuss this not in a reactive way, but in a curious, exploratory way. And that becomes really, really, that is good psychotherapy.
Yeah, a lot of times all these things are subconscious, right? Like we don't,
Completely.
we're not just thinking, we're not a young child and we think, oh, my parents, these adults, they're authoritarian, and therefore consciously I'm gonna think all adults are authoritarian. That doesn't happen. Sometimes you have no idea that even happened inside your brain. Somehow there's some trigger and your nervous system responds and you act accordingly.
Yeah.
Um, so that's a really interesting thing. And also, I wanted to bring up, because I think this is a really interesting point. we're, fight or flight, like you mentioned earlier, is only meant to be like a 20-minute thing or a very short amount of time. And but today, we live in a pretty, advanced civilization, and we have all this technology and money, but our mental health doesn't seem to be keeping up with that. And a lot of people are in a chronic, all the time, sympathetic nervous system state. They're chronically stressed and chronically anxious or depressed. And I don't see that declining in any sense, at least from what I'm aware. And and I had a really interesting insight a while ago. We're the same. They estimate that we're the same animal, the same human, in the same human form or anatomical form about 200,000 years ago. It's like they estimate, somewhere in Africa, right in the savannas, about 200,000 years ago is when the first human, like Homo sapien, was formed. And so that means we have the exact same biology, we have the exact same physiology as we did 200,000 years ago. However, we evolved to survive and to reproduce and pass on our genetics, along familial lines, and in a very different kind of environment than what we are in today. So we are in a very artificial environment, and I think it's great, but there's definitely a lot of issues, and we didn't evolve to be in this kind of environment. So of course there's going to be certain things that we're unprepared for. Our nervous system evolved in a very different environment out there with being nomadic or hunter-gatherers or whatever we were 200,000 years ago and beyond. So that's why now it's actually really important to find tools like biofeedback and psychedelics, which we can periodically use so that we can combat this, our bodies constantly being in an environment that's not normal from an evolutionary perspective.
Yeah, and it's not just environment, it's lifestyle.
Mm,
Like I'd say most, at least, white collar jobs, you're sitting the entire day. Um, there's a great book called The Hour Between Dog and Wolf. I forget the author's name, so I apologize to him, but you can find it pretty easily. And in pretty early on in the book, he gives an overlay of neurophysiology, uses a bit of a different framework from what I've been speaking from, but he points out a lot of our brain is so much larger, relatively speaking, than other animals, and there's always been this question in the scientific community of like, why? And there's a really interesting perspective, which is because we move very differently than other animals, right? We walk on 2 feet and we have way more fine kind of motor skills. It's so like with like computer imaging, it's pretty easy to map the movement of like a dog, to recreate it. It's pretty difficult to accurately do it with a human. Our movement is far more complex, and so our brain, a lot of our brain power is uh, devoted to us moving. But if we're static the entire day, then our brain is going to atrophy, and that's just not going to feel good. Everything we always want homeostasis. It's not going to happen if we're not using our brain for the way it's designed to be. So, you know, standing desk actually makes a big difference. I have in my office like a balance beam. I'll just put out and I can get 3 minutes here, 5 minutes there. That's great. I have a pull-up bar. I can go for if I have a phone call session, I'll go for a walk. All of that, these things which you wouldn't necessarily correlate with anxiety, they absolutely are. Yeah, so that's a really important thing to know. And you mentioned psychedelics and ketamine. We should probably talk about that being on the psychedelic scene podcast. But all of this really has been a build-up to that, or fits very neatly with that. Um, so, from a very similar framework to how I was talking about biofeedback, in terms of putting the body in a coherent state, and then same with how I talked about somatic therapy. You let the body's intelligence, you put it in a position for it to do what it knows how to do, what it knows that it needs to do. Um, and so coupling that, right, and that's also very similar to how generally people talk about psychedelic therapy.
mm,
Uh, the medicine, be it ketamine or psilocybin or MDMA or ayahuasca, whatever it is, it allows you to access your body's inner healing intelligence. Right? That's the language that's used. So if we, and this is I do with not all, but most of my clients know I've taught heart rate variability biofeedback, HRV biofeedback to them, whether or not we're using ketamine. But for the ones who I do use ketamine with, I'll encourage them. Obviously, it's up to them, but they always click with the biofeedback, so they want to do it anyways. But before they take the ketamine, in my office we use lozenges for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
So before they take the ketamine lozenge, they will do, 10, 15 minutes of HRV biofeedback to put themselves in the most coherent state, so their body's in a position to do what it needs to do and not be, starting off the bat in this stress state where it's already going to be off balance and going haywire. And so this isn't circumventing anything. This isn't circumventing the anxiety. This isn't kind of ignoring it or just kind of technologically dissipating it. Not at all. It's just providing a clearer pathway to then interact with the actual root of the anxiety. So then when you're in that state going into a ketamine experience, um, it just compounds itself because the ketamine also puts the body in a state where it has more access to do what it needs to do, right? The ketamine isn't bringing up these memories or these thoughts or making these connections. It's interacting with your body in a way that your body can then do that. And so combining them is really, really powerful. And it's also powerful for integration, right? Ketamine
Mm-hmm.
experiences or any experiences, even if it's holotropic breath work or a yoga session, or a massive LSD trip, which was 10 or 11 hours long. It's intense, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
healing and intense, and a big part of the integration can be augmented or aided by continually putting yourself in a coherent state through, and it's very simple once you know how to do HRV biofeedback. Um, I also want to talk about combining neurofeedback and ketamine because I think I haven't done this with anyone yet. I do a lot of neurofeedback, but I've never combined neurofeedback with ketamine. But what neurofeedback is, it's neurofeedback, it's biofeedback on brain waves. It's also often called EEG or electroencephalogram biofeedback, which is just the electric signal of brain waves. And so, just a simple example, just to paint a quick picture of what neurofeedback is let's say someone has ADD or just trouble focusing. So we'll do a brain scan. We'll compare an EEG brain scan. We'll compare their brain scan to a database of quote unquote, normative brains. So people who don't have
Mm-hmm.
issues with focusing. We'll see how they deviate from the norm, and then we'll train their brain back towards that norm. So I'm going to use very broad terms. Let's say the person's brain is, in the frontal area of the brain. It's too slow. It's too slow to focus properly. So we'll train it to go faster to, within the optimum range. And that might be done, they're wearing a cap with EEG electrodes sensing the brain. They're watching, it could be they're watching a movie when their brain is doing what we want it to do, when it's in that, towards that normative mean, the screen is perfectly clear. They're just watching a movie. When they deviate from that, if the brain starts going too slow, the screen will turn fuzzy or go dark. Um, and both because they know that their goal is to uh, keep the screen clear, but also because they just want to watch the movie, um, they will rapidly subconsciously figure out how to keep the screen clear. And you do that enough times, your brain just learns this other state. So you can do that with, I mean, essentially any metric you want within the brain. So you can do that for, the anxiety network. You can work directly with the amygdala and the hippocampus. You can be pretty targeted with this. So a neurofeedback session creates neuroplasticity. Right? It uses existing neuroplasticity to then create more neuroplasticity the same way weightlifting, you use existing strength to build more strength.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so the neuroplasticity, most most research articles will quote like a 24-hour window of increased neuroplasticity following one 20-minute neurofeedback session. Um, However, it makes sense theoretically to me that that's it's not just plastic like moldable in any way. It's in a specific direction because
Mm-hmm.
you've been training in a very specific way with specific pathways, right? We like to think of the brain in terms of pathways.
Mm.
And so you have more of a tilt or kind of a you're leaning in towards those pathways for 24 hours after the neurofeedback session. And obviously if you do enough neurofeedback sessions, those pathways should be kind of carved and established. So ketamine also creates neuroplasticity, also in somewhat specific ways, right? In sub-anesthetic doses, ketamine has anti-anxiety, antidepressive, and anti-suicidal properties because it interacts with the glutamate and GABA system um, in an agitating kind of way. By doing so, right, that's just kind of like this overall perturbation event, which it creates a ton of neuroplasticity, specifically with the neurotransmitters that or the neurotransmitters specifically, glutamate and GABA, which is heavily involved in depression, anxiety, and a lot of the mental health pathologies that we talk about. So if we combine this massive just perturbation neuroplasticity event with of ketamine, and we kind of pre-lay those tracks with neurofeedback. So let's say someone is doing it specifically for anxiety. We do an anti-anxiety neurofeedback protocol. So those tracks are kind of laid. Yeah, I'll use a snow globe example that's become pretty ubiquitous in the psychedelic
Mm.
world. Um, it's kind of like the snow cats going out. We know a snowstorm is coming, and we don't like the existing ski paths. We want to create new ones before the storm comes. We're going to go out. We're going to create kind of boundaries. We're going to delineate these paths. So when the huge snowfall comes, it's going to fall already in a little bit of a pre-designated track that's already going to be pre-carved out. And then snowcats can go up again and just finish the work or just, keep doing it. And so combining neurofeedback with ketamine, I would imagine creates this wonderful kind of mutually augmenting feedback loop. Um, yeah. So I haven't done that with anyone yet. Um, I've done each individually and separately, and they're both very powerful by themselves. And it's not always the case where two good things, one good thing plus one good thing equals a better thing. But this theoretically at least makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And yeah, ketamine is, seems to, induces all this neuroplasticity. But like you said, with the biofeedback and neurofeedback, it tends to, like, how do I explain it? So these psychedelics they do create neuroplasticity. They do obviously really impact us in a very drastic way, oftentimes. And but when you go through the therapy process, it almost always changes it in the positive direction. Like it's very rare that somebody will have a really like if they take it in a right set and setting, it's very rare that somebody will get worse. It does happen, of course, but a significant amount of the time it tends to be in a positive direction. And that may just because it's helping somebody become more self-aware, you know, they can discover more about themselves. It may help give new perspective, and that perspective is expanding their knowledge in some sense and can help them perceive things that would have either been a threat, but it's now making you a little bit more aware and realizing why you feel that's a threat and it's not really a threat, and that's going to be a long-lasting therapeutic change. And and then also one more point. Also, you said with you take the biofeedback wait, you do neurofeedback before ketamine, right? So you do
I,
neurofeedback.
I would like to. What I do now is I give the option for clients to who already know it to do heart rate variability biofeedback before ketamine and
Okay.
after. But yeah.
Yeah, everyone in the psychedelic space or even outside now know how important set and setting is for any psychedelic experience. And Stanislav Grof, who's the famous holotropic breathwork, brought that one of the co-founders of transpersonal psychology or the psychology of altered states of consciousness. He had done a few thousand LSD trips, one of the first therapists to really do a few thousand LSD psychotherapy events back in, late maybe 40s or 50s and so forth until it became outlawed. He said the psychedelics are an unspecific amplifier of mental processes. So if you are going into a psychedelic state, and you're in a very chronically stressed state, or you're anticipating danger, or you don't feel safe, it may not necessarily end up bad, because a lot of times, even in those situations, sometimes you end up having a good experience, or often do, but it increases your likelihood of having a negative experience. And if you're using that biofeedback before ketamine, it reduces the chance. It puts you in a good mindset, the set and setting. It puts you in a good set, which is mindset, right? Before, so that
Mhm.
you can maximize the benefits and reduce some of those negative possibilities, right? Because of the state you're in.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that in. So I agree with everything you said, and I would even taking it a step deeper. Right, this psychedelics do require us to re-examine what a trip is, or what a quote unquote negative experience is, right? Because
Yeah.
there's a, you know, there's a saying. I don't know who originated it, who coined the term. If you come across a dragon, on your trip, in your psychedelic journey, you need to jump in its mouth. Like you need to do the scary, you need to go towards the
Mm,
thing you're afraid of. You can't run away. You can run away from it, but you know, you're just gonna have a shitty time. And you're gonna come out of that with not really having accomplished much. So you need to go towards the thing that you're afraid of. You need to go towards the uncomfortability, not in a masochistic way, but you need to confront these things. You need to work through them, not, ignore them or run away from them. And so if, and this is the same thing, you can, in psychedelics or not psychedelics, if you're predisposed, you're already in a stress state, or you're already tilted towards sympathetic arousal, you're gonna kind of jump to that conclusion. You're going to jump to the stress state response kind of as a default.
mm,
So if we can get your mindset in the right place, which includes your mind includes your neurophysiology. Your mind isn't this floating entity, right? We're not floating heads. It's very grounded in our physical selves. If we can put that in a position where it's not going to be just instinctively, not even instinctively, where it's not going to be predisposed to react
mm,
negatively, or with a stress response, where it can maybe react with curiosity or openness, or it can interact with this memory or this person from their lives or their past who was harmful to them. Instead of running from them just as an instinct, we can maybe interact with them with some curiosity and find some other way to experience that person or that thought or that event or that memory, which is, again, that's what good psychotherapy is.
mm,
Psychedelics don't replace psychotherapy, they augment it, to take Stan Groff's
mm,
language. And so there's another quote you said, they're non-specific amplifiers,
mm,
quoting Stan Groff. There's another quote, you know, in your trip, if you think you're going to meet God, you'll meet God. If you think you're going to meet the devil, you meet the devil. Right? And this really gets at the placebo effect, and it
mm,
demands that we look at placebo effect really differently. We usually, typically we think of placebo effect as being something bad, like as something to discount
mm,
something. We're going to do a study of SSRIs, and the control group is going to be taking a placebo sugar pill, whatever. And in a lot of studies, the control group has, significant results, sometimes more than the SSRIs. So we throw out the whole study. What some people are starting to do, the way I look at that is, holy crap, these people took a sugar pill. They had clinically significant anxiety or depression, and with a sugar pill, they had clinically significant reductions of that. We need to look at that, right? So that is the power of mindset. That is the placebo effect, is a tool. It's a power that we have as humans, and we need to capitalize on that. We need to use that to our advantage. And so that really is one way that both neurofeedback and HRV biofeedback and some other forms of biofeedback, which I didn't even mention, that's a tool you can use in that direction. It gives you agency.
yeah, I mean, it's empowering, to know that the placebo effect exists, right? If all that happened was that you strongly believe something will help you, and it does, maybe not to the degree that if you took something like a medicine that works, but it does, right? It heals you a little bit just from thinking, just from believing. That could be an empowering thing right there, I would say.
a lot of the studies, not I won't quote specifics. I know for sure some studies specific with SSRIs, the
Mm.
control groups had more significant results than the SSRI groups. Um, yeah. So that's the power of our mind, of our choice. If you really believe something, really choose to pursue something, we can accomplish far more. We are far more dynamic than we typically think of ourselves. We have far more agency within ourselves than we typically allow ourselves to use.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also like that should feel really good, right? Because that means you're not pawns on a chess table where everything around you is just pushing you around. You don't have any agency, right? We do have some kind of agency, and we can make certain choices. We can, the placebo effect. We can think positively or in a certain way, and that's gonna also guide the growth or healing process or whatnot. So yeah, biofeedback is at least theoretically, when I would assume, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be an excellent preparation tool for a ketamine experience going into it.
Hmm.
And then also because ketamine, part of the reason ketamine is therapeutic is because it puts you in a susceptible state, probably for a few days, right? Some of that neuroplasticity lasts for a little bit
Hmm.
longer, and that and other than the perspective change, that neuroplasticity gives you time. It gives you the ability to make it more easier to shift your perspective, to shift whatever it is you need to shift in your nervous system, really, right? And thought pattern. And now add on biofeedback or neurofeedback, and not only are you in a susceptible state to change, not only are you in a more malleable plastic state, now you have something like neurofeedback which can guide, it can increase, it can enhance that um, the neuroplasticity and guide you in the right direction to change
Hmm.
in the way you'd like to. Like if it's
Yeah.
some kind of, maybe you shrug your shoulders all the time, when you're in public, and that's maybe what you're trying to change. And you go into the ketamine and you have that moment of that you're like, how do I explain it? You're in a susceptible neuroplastic state and you have the ability now to maybe do something about that. Your shoulders always going up and down or going up in a stressful situation in public. And ketamine might give you some kind of perspective or help you understand why you have that and you're in a malleable state. And now you add neurofeedback and it's much easier to change. And you're likely to change in the positive direction because it's a guiding tool
Yeah. You're changing in a specific direction of your choice,
of your
for sure.
choice.
Yeah. Um, yeah, if you have a good neurofeedback practitioner, you can be quite specific with what you train and what you accomplish. And that's also a really good point. If you're using HRV biofeedback as part of the integration process while your brain is in this more malleable state, right? So if your nervous system, right, in your body is in a sympathetic arousal state, in a fight or flight state, that's sending messages up to your brain to activate the amygdala, to shut down, the rational parts of your brain. It's basically it's saying activate, like all hands on deck, anything non-essential to surviving, we need to turn off because we need to just focus on surviving. So if you can turn that off or balance that by restoring, full spectrum nervous system balance, coherence, that is also sending signals to your brain for saying, no, let's downregulate the stress state, right? Let's restore functionality to frontal prefrontal cortex, to memory formation centers. Let's calm the hippocampus down. Let's calm the amygdala down. And if you're doing that in a malleable state, your brain is learning that, times times two, times 10, however much it is. So yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, that's really powerful, and I'm surprised I've never thought of this. Like when you share it, it's like, how did we not? Why are we not talking about this?
Right.
You know?
Hindsight's 2020.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I was thinking also. Let me see. So Yeah, so ketamine, and other psychedelics are going to kind of work in a similar way. But one of the things, they originally ketamine was a how do I explain it? It was used as an alternative. They were trying to develop an alternative to phencyclidine, PCP, right? PCP or phencyclidine, which is another dissociative anesthetic, same class of drugs as ketamine. And PCP, they used it in the emergency rooms to put people to sleep. But then they would finish the operation, they'd finish the surgery, and these people would still be tripping for several hours. They called it like, I don't know, like an emergence. I don't know, they had some kind of name. It's some kind of condition they called it, and emergence phenomenon or emergence. But it worked so powerfully. It was such an amazing anesthetic, but they didn't want people just tripping for hours on after surgery. So they went to try and actually like create an alternative, and that was when they created, I think early 60s, 62, something along that lines, that somebody found it discovered ketamine. They created ketamine in a laboratory from PCP because ketamine has a PCP ring around it, right? And ketamine was much shorter lasting. It's about an hour, maybe a little bit longer than that. Very short, unlike psilocybin or LSD. Those are much longer experiences. Yeah, that is one of the advantages of ketamine also is that it's a short experience, you know. And let me see. So that was, yeah, ketamine was developed for that. And they noticed in the 1990s, when they were giving ketamine, that a lot of people would come back with these reports. I think in Russia they published this, if I recall. People would come back and be like, "Hey, my depression's gone," or, "I just had a surgery and all of a sudden my depression's gone." That's how does that work, right? And I think this is what, like,
Yeah.
the initial reason why they started to study ketamine for mental health in the 90s, because of all these like anecdotal reports. Um, and But ketamine also today, so it's used to treat several things. Major depressive disorder, treatment-resistant depression. There's been some amazing study results for these. Then there's, let's see, suicidal ideation. There's a lot of people, they are not recommended to take any psychedelic if they're suicidal because it might push them over the edge. All right. But what's unique or semi-unique about ketamine is it doesn't do that. Ketamine isn't going to push you over the edge if you're suicidal, and in fact, it has such a rapid acting effect that within 24 hours, a lot of these individuals no longer are suicidal. And they may have to come back in a month or two, but it buys them a lot of time. It's like they have no suicidal thoughts, for the most part, after just one or two or three ketamine
Hmm.
experiences. And you can take ketamine even if you're on like SSRIs, you can't take things like ayahuasca or psilocybin or MDMA, or they're not going to be effective if you're on SSRIs. But with ketamine, you still can. And then
Hmm.
one last thing, chronic pain. Right? You mentioned earlier something about, if somebody's in a lot of pain and they have some muscle stiffness there, even though the issue that the pain was trying to signal to your brain isn't there anymore. It's resolved itself. But now you've developed this, um, it's almost like those pain signals are built into your nervous system now. Like it was programmed, even though the pain's not there. Sorry, even though the issue's not there anymore, it's your nervous system now believes it still is. And now ketamine somehow, through neuroplasticity, is able to is able to somehow interrupt that and change it. It's
Hmm.
able to be like, hey, there's no actual issue there, and it changes your nervous system in such a way that, it's been really helpful for a lot of people, not everybody, as a chronic pain treatment. And
Right.
sometimes, it may not work the first time. They may have to do a session once every so often, but it's really powerful in that way. It's just interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just specific to the chronic pain thing and the way you described it, like one, we form habits, and that's a really important thing that we do. Again, going back to the doorknob example, if we didn't have the habit of just immediately interacting with the doorknob properly, we had to re-figure out what a doorknob is, how it works. We wouldn't get anything done. But this is also true for bad habits, for bad ways of thinking, for pain, for learned things in the body, or learned things cognitively. And so the way I keep describing it as like a perturbation event that that shakes things up. It gives you the ability to at least it gives you the opportunity at least
Mm.
to new habits. And so you can do
Yeah,
that with pain also.
and then with that, now you have the neurofeedback, which is so you can in the right direction, the way you want it to change.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, that is yeah, that is really good. How? Oh yeah, so you said you recently started combining these in a sense, right? Very recently, and or
Yeah. Well, so I've only recently started working with ketamine.
okay.
In the last few months did we open the ketamine branch at the clinic, at the private practice that I'm at.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see, like, to hear. I mean, you may not have like any published research studies yet or all the numbers, but I'm just, what's your general sense like of like how this has been, how effective this is compared to maybe just the biofeedback alone? Um, what have you noticed in your own practice with this?
Um, it would be hard to quantify. It would be hard to quantify, slash, you always lose the bigger picture when you try to quantify things in
Oh
these
yeah.
hyper specific ways, which are, it's important, they're powerful tools, these clinical research studies. But when you get hyper specific enough to have a legitimate research study that's approved by an IRB, approval board and things like that, you definitely lose the bigger picture. Um, so, you know, uh, I can't quantify it, but what I can say is, and this is the general framework, the way I work with people, anyways, is I want to give as many tools as I can. Uh, Basically, I want the person to discover their own agency, and so you can discover that within a ketamine trip. You can discover that within good talk therapy. You can discover that with biofeedback. You can discover that. I encourage not everyone, but a lot of people, to start doing cold plunges and start doing hit type of workouts and things that really um, uh,
Mm,
stretch the nervous system. We don't want to get to the point of stressing it, like meaning in a bad way, but good healthy stress so that you can then self-regulate. So like this past weekend, I was in New Hampshire with some of my family and some family friends, and there was a freezing creek right out back. And we spent a lot of time just sitting in this freezing creek, and it actually starts feeling really, really good once, so you jump in freezing cold water, your initial reaction is a stress response, right? You start that hyperventilating, the thoracic breathing, the really shallow breaths, all the blood is shunted to your core. If you can consciously and intentionally choose to start breathing in the way I described HRV breath, these long, slow belly breaths, you can retake control over your nervous system. And there's agency in that. And all it starts to feel really good. And so if you can exercise that in acute situations, like jumping in a freezing cold river in New Hampshire, then when you get to, I don't know, um, uh, I don't know, some other stressful situation in life, maybe, you short stop and because you almost had a car accident, or you actually do get in a car accident, right? Your nervous system is more resilient to respond to that because it's used to, having a spike and then having you bring it back down. And so all of the framework I work with people is giving them tools. So how, I don't know how I would quantify that,
mm,
but I can see it. I can hear in the way people start talking about things instead of having this kind of woe is me victim mindset, or even if they are victims, like literally, like technically speaking, fine, but it happened to you, or that's the situation, or that's what you got. So you can complain about it all you want, and there's room for that, and it's okay to vent sometimes,
Hmm.
But moving forward, you need to own it and you need to do something either about it or remove yourself from the situation or put up proper boundaries. But you need to claim agency where and when you can. And so these tools are really powerful for that. And I see that just in the way people start talking about things, where it's ceases to be this thing happened to me and it starts being this is a thing, here's how I'm reacting to it.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to wrap up soon. I think the last thing I want to end on, because I think it's really interesting, is um, well, I want to bring up a point, but I do want to. I think the Raynaud syndrome, your history with that, because you brought up cold therapy, and I remember in your blog talking about how cold therapy was part of the process for healing Raynaud's therapy and or cold showers. But a lot of people, probably even listening to this, probably know who Wim Hof is, right?
Yeah,
The Wim Hof method isn't just cold exposure. It isn't just breath work. It's combining them, right, in a certain way. And Wim Hof is actually really interesting because there's been some research studies that have been done on him where they would inject him with some kind of virus. And how did it work? He was able to control his immune response through breath.
yeah. They injected him with E. coli, and he was able to work with his nervous slash immune system and not have the response that everyone else has. And he was able to teach it to other people also.
Yeah, like them. That's like, wow, our breath is a really powerful tool, and if we know how to use it properly, it could be life-changing. And
Yeah,
he's able to stay in very, very cold temperatures for a very long time, partly because he's able to regulate his immune system, regulate his autonomic nervous system, which is supposed to be generally automatic,
right.
subconscious, right? Like, but he's been able to like find a way to have some kind of effect on it through the breath,
Yeah,
which
uh,
and
yeah, definitely. The term autonomic is kind of a holdover from like the 1950s behavioral uh, framework. It's largely autonomic, but we also have a huge level of control if we choose to exercise it.
yeah, yeah. And then you also brought up there's a topic in biology called hormesis. I don't know if you've heard of hormesis. Um, it's related to the general concept that Nassim Taleb wrote about in his book Anti-Fragile, how certain systems gain from order and disorder, stress, tension, etc. But he was like there wasn't a term, right, for something that's the opposite of fragile, right? Whenever you ask what anybody, and I've done this actually many times, I'm like, what would be the opposite of fragile? Like the actual opposite. Something that's fragile breaks easily under any sort of stress, tension, right? Like a glass or something. And then you ask, okay, what's the opposite of that? And people will say resilient. And I'm like, um, you're close. Something that's really hard, you can't break, like a diamond. You keep giving it all the stress you want, tension. It's very hard to really affect it. You need massive amount of energy. Um, but that's not really the opposite because in both of those cases, you're still doing harm to the system, right? Through all that stress and tension. The opposite would have to be something that actually like grows in some way. It doesn't break, it grows. And there's a lot of things like our muscles when we're working out,
Hmm.
right? You don't want to do it too much, so, because then you can rip something. So anti-fragility generally has limits, hormesis in the biology terms. But within a certain range, by putting stress and tension and stretching our muscles, our body has a system in place to now, you know, repair itself there and then maybe even grow larger. Our immune system is another one, right? If we're not, if we're, and then they did a really well-known study now about peanut allergies, um, where they took two groups of people, parents, and they asked in one group, they asked the parents, the traditional advice, avoid peanuts at all costs, anything to do with peanuts. These children are, just born, they're very young. And that's the traditional advice usually. And then they took a whole group of parents and said, no, let's actually expose those children to peanuts as much as possible. And when they followed these children for many years, the group that, was exposed to the peanuts and peanut allergies, they had a much lower incidence of
Hmm.
having peanut allergies.
Hmm.
And the same thing goes if you're in a very pristine, clean environment, you're never exposed to pathogens, viruses, or bacteria, your immune system hasn't been building itself. It hasn't been learning, it hasn't been creating antibodies. It hasn't been, it may even like probably get weaker, who knows? And, then they go out into the world, they have no ability to defend themselves. They're probably going to die or something. But somebody who is constantly exposed to pathogens, again, not too much, right? Because if you're exposed to too severe pathogens or too many pathogens, you could, die or have some major severe illnesses. But if you're constantly at a low level of being exposed to different viruses, different pathogens, your immune system is going to continuously learn from those exposures and grow and become stronger. So so like cold therapy, I think you mentioned part of the benefits of cold therapy, and I think there's a few. One is its ability to train your nervous system to be able to be more resilient against stress. And by constantly exposing yourself to the cold and to this short-term stress, you don't want to be always stressed, obviously, but just a little bit stressed. We're meant to be exposed to short amounts of stress and grow. Not to be in a chronic state all the time, but we're meant to, saunas work very well. We need some exposure to heat for a short
Yeah.
time. Cold therapy works extremely well. There's so much value. It's, I wish everyone knew about it, to be honest. Cold therapy works by putting some stress on your system, and through hormesis, your nervous system becomes stronger or trained to be able to handle this even better. And I could go on and on. I think we all get that. But we are meant, we evolved to, be put under certain stressful conditions for a very short period of time. And in today's
Yeah.
very comfortable environment, and we're not getting exposed to heat, we're not being exposed to cold, we're not, being exposed to certain kinds of stressors like we should, we're getting weaker. And that might even be one of the reasons why our health is in decline on average of many reasons.
Yeah.
But yeah, yeah, so you said about Raynaud's syndrome. What is that? How does it
Yeah.
tie into all of this that we've talked about today? How did you use, what we've been discussing today to heal that? Yeah.
Yeah. So Raynaud's or Raynaud's, I've heard it pronounced a few different ways.
Okay.
So Raynaud's syndrome it literally just describes the physiological response to stress. Um, Most people don't talk about it that way, but shortly before my son was born, I had some elbow issues and I couldn't really figure out what was going on. Like I could use it, whatever. I went to a chiropractor and he noticed, and it was in the middle of winter, so I'd show up and he would notice, and my fingers would often be very white. I'd kind of be wearing like an extra like more layers than everyone else in that in his office, and a few other things. And he mentioned Raynaud's syndrome to me. Might want to look into it. Never heard about it before. Looked into it around the same time I started learning about or shortly after that, I started working at the practice I work at. Dr. Reiner introduced me to neurofeedback and biofeedback, and did a deep dive because I became fascinated with just the physiology of stress. And it's literally the exact same symptoms as Raynaud's syndrome. So Raynaud's syndrome is like an intolerance to cold. Fingers turn kind of white in like high 60s weather, like high 60s degrees weather, like when it really shouldn't be doing things like that. So part of the physiology of stress is your body shunts all of the or most of the blood from your extremities, so from your feet and your hands, to your core and your trunk. Because let's go back to the lion example. You don't need fine articulation and manipulation of your fingertips. You need raw power, to either fight or flee. So that's part of the physiology of stress. And that also, if you're in a sympathetic dominant state, It doesn't mean you're necessarily always anxious, but your neurophysiology kind of tilts that way. Your body's gonna just have a less robust response to cold. So smaller input creates a larger output. So instead of needing it to be like sub-freezing for your fingers to turn white, it only needs to be like 65 degrees and my fingers would turn white. You
Mm-hmm.
know, it would be like, you know, a late summer day, pretty warm out, and I would jump in a cold spring and my hands would stay white. Like it was ridiculous. And I was clearly like in good shape. It didn't make any sense. So when I learned about the neurophysiology of stress and it just mapped perfectly onto the symptoms of Raynaud syndrome, I was like, oh, I'm Raynaud syndrome is just sympathetic dominance. I need to retrain my nervous system to a state of balance. And I did that through a lot of HRV biofeedback, which we talked about a lot on this podcast. Um, hit type of workouts. So, really high intensity things where I would really kind of stress my nervous system for an acute short period of time. And then I would do more HRV biofeedback or just the breathing or something else to bring to bring everything back down into regulation. So it's kind of exercising my nervous system intentionally in that way. And the same thing with cold exposure, right? I would put myself in the cold, right? I was artificially exposing myself to a stressor. My nervous system would have the stress response, and I would very intentionally, bring it back down via my breath. And also, there's a mental kind of meditative component to that as well. I am a big time meditator, and that played a role. Specific to Raynaud's, I also started taking. It was only for like 2 to 3 months, but niacin, like active niacin, which causes the flushing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a vasodilator, and it just kind of made it it capitalized on everything also because it just let my blood vessels work more efficiently. A lot of rock climbers do kind of acute
Mm-hmm.
niacin therapies and things like that. So the combination of that really rewired my nervous system. And so simultaneous to not having Raynaud syndrome anymore, I could be in 65-degree weather in shorts and a t-shirt and be fine. And I can do that now. I'll notice if I'm more stressed or underslept or something, I
Mm-hmm.
trend back towards the Raynaud's type of symptoms. But also I was just more resilient, obviously. I was going through my job search, I get rejected from 10 different places. It didn't affect me as much as I would have expected it to prior to doing all of this nervous system re-regulation. So the two aren't separate in any way, shape, or form. It's just different levels, different layers of the same thing.
Yeah, just like anxiety disorder versus anxiety. Like what makes it a disorder is when it really starts to, interfere with your life and pursuing your values, right? But anxiety, a little bit anxiety is always, you want it, right? Without anxiety, you, you probably die, right? Because you'd have no forward ability to detect threat and prepare for those situations. So probably the same thing, right? It's a matter of degree,
It's definitely a
right?
matter of degree. It's a matter. There's also some definitional things
Okay.
in that. Just how if you're being mugged and you're having the physiological stress response, I'm not going to say you're anxious, right? You're having an appropriate stress response,
Yeah.
right? So the problem becomes when there's a mismatch between what you're perceiving and what your body's perceiving versus actual
Mm,
external reality. But yeah, there's absolutely a spectrum. You can have moments of anxiety and you shouldn't qualify for anxiety disorder.
mm,
But it is the same spectrum. So the same tools that would be useful for someone who's, full-blown diagnosed anxiety disorder, so still useful and effective for a person just further down that same spectrum.
yeah. Um, well, how would how would people, they learned all these things today, biofeedback, neurofeedback, ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. I mean, ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, for one, is very rare. There's a lot of ketamine clinics, a lot of people who do IV, IM ketamine. Some of them, like, I used to work at a clinic who used like troches, ketamine troches, sublingual. Like, how do people, like, if they want to, you know, access these technologies or these tools, like, start to work on themselves, what tips do you have for them? I know you mentioned HeartMath. I think they have this EM Wave 2 device or something.
Yeah, they have some good things. I have some good resources on my website. I have a hefty kind of HRV overview and explanation, also with some links and resources in that. So maybe in the show notes you can put a link to my website, and then within that there's other resources as well. And I would say to people, because yeah, definitely the ketamine, like the medical model ketamine clinics, which is without psychotherapy, are far more ubiquitous than ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, which is, the way I've been talking about things. I'd say be creative, right? So you can have a talk therapist who isn't a ketamine assisted psychotherapist, and kind of, in concert with them, you can go to a medical model ketamine clinic, and they don't have to go with you to it, but you can
Hmm.
have a session, the morning of, to prepare for your ketamine infusion, and then schedule a session the next day for integration. So you can be, you need to be creative. It's your healing. You don't, if it's not going to be served to you on a silver platter. I think there's actually benefit for it not being served to you on a silver platter, because you need to be involved actively in your own healing. And also, though, the trend, we talked about trends and stigmas and things at the beginning of this chat. Um, the trend is really shifting. So I spoke about maybe 2 years ago with a number of owners or directors of medical model
Hmm.
ketamine clinics, which, again, that's without psychotherapy, and trying to see, again, I was being creative, post grad school. Can I have a position here? Can I create a position here? People want to have psychotherapy included to help them process the heck just happened. I was on Mars. I need someone to help me process that. They were really against it, pretty much across the board. In the past two
Hmm.
months, I've had, I can't even count off the top of my head how many medical model ketamine clinics have reached out to me, trying and wanting to get either referral services so that they can refer their clients to psychotherapists, or have someone come in to be kind of in-house, that type of thing. So the trend really is shifting. Um, I think really just because the patient demand for it, and want for it and need for it is so, it overwhelms whatever ideology was functioning on the people who are, no, this is just chemical. We just want to interact chemically with your brain, and you can go to heaven or hell. It doesn't matter as long as the chemical inside your body. Well, they're also business owners, and their customers want this, so it is shifting in that way as well. Yeah.
And then
So
yeah.
go ahead. No, no, go
I was
ahead.
gonna say, yeah, and then so yeah, and then what about like what would they look for if they wanted to do clinics? Like, is there a lot of clinics that offer biofeedback and neurofeedback, or they have to buy their own devices at home?
Yeah. So like the private practice I work at, we have in-house a ton of biofeedback technology. I always recommend my clients to buy their own, because they don't want to be coming into the clinic every single day, right? You want to
Yeah.
be able to do it yourself. So I've also taught it to people, via Zoom. They'll buy their device, they'll hook it up, and we'll have a Zoom session where I'm teaching them how to use it. I can generally teach it to people in one session. There's a lot of resources online also, if you don't want to schedule, a session with me or someone else who is well versed in these things. But yeah, if you're on Psychology Today or something,
Hmm.
so a website like that, you can put in, if a therapist works with biofeedback and neurofeedback, they'll put it on their profile. It's a rare skill. So you can look it up that way as well.
Are they, so you talked about your website, Brian Lissak, which is Lissak.com,
Yeah,
brianlissack.com. Could they email you if they wanted to have
mhm.
like a consultation or something?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. My contact info is, you can get it through the website.
Okay. Yeah, well, I really appreciate this, you coming on and talking about this. Uh, if people want to come learn more about you, brianlissack.com. And do you have any projects you're working on right now that
Uh,
are interesting? Okay.
yeah, for sure. A
Yeah,
lot of projects. We could have a whole nother episode about
yeah,
that.
yeah.
I'll leave it at that for now.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Brian, with Brian Lisak. Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for making it this far and listening to this podcast. And I'll put some notes in the show notes below, so you can, in his website in the show notes and stuff. All right. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.